Her crown was made of gold, but it was forged to break her. At just 14, Marie Antoinette was torn from Austria, stripped of her name, and handed to France like a gift no one truly wanted. She arrived in Versailles wrapped in silks and expectations, a child sent to charm a kingdom already unraveling. They dressed her like a queen, but trained her like a puppet. Every smile rehearsed, every silence measured, and behind the glitter of courtly ritual, the trap was already closing. History would call her frivolous, scandalous, a symbol of royal decay. But before the hatred, before the revolution, there was only a girl, young, isolated, and slowly drowning beneath the weight of a role she never chose. How did she go from golden bride to national villain? And why did the world choose her to blame when the crown began to crumble? She was born in a palace of chandeliers and diplomacy, where lullabies were sung in 6 languages and every hallway echoed with the soft rustle of silk and strategy. Maria Antonia Josepha Johanna, the 15th child of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, was not expected to rule, only to serve. Her fate, like her name, was long and heavy, stitched from the fabric of empire. Vienna, for all its beauty, was never a place of softness. Not for daughters of the Habsburg line. Behind the operas and masked balls, behind the embroidered cushions and frescoed ceilings, lay a fortress of control built by a woman who had worn a crown like armor. Maria Theresa, one of the most powerful sovereigns in Europe, ruled with iron veiled in satin. She bore 16 children and raised them like chess pieces. To marry, to obey, to preserve the fragile symmetry of a crumbling world order. Antonia, as they called her then, grew up in the shadow of that grandeur. A little girl flitting through marble halls, her curls powdered white by nurses, her posture corrected by governesses who measured grace in degrees and failures in tears. She learned to curtsy before she learned to read. She learned to dance before she was taught to speak French. But she did not learn affection. Her mother loved only when useful, approved only when perfection was achieved. And Antonia was never perfect. Her French accent was clumsy, her penmanship poor, her curiosity too childlike. She smiled too much. She asked too many questions. And while her brothers were trained in the art of war, Antonia was trained to be pleasing, a porcelain figurine in the empire's vast cabinet of heirs. But what Antonia lacked in polish, she made up for in radiance. She was charming in the way girls are before the world teaches them fear. Her laughter was easy, her presence warm. And soon enough, that warmth would be packaged and sent across a continent, a gift to soothe an ancient feud. France, the enemy, once, the ally. Now, thanks to the shifting alliances of men who carve treaties with knives in their sleeves. To seal the fragile peace, a marriage was arranged between Antonia and the Dauphin of France. Louis Auguste, grandson of Louis XV, awkward and shy, the future king of a kingdom already cracking. The match was not about love. No one asked if she wanted it. It was a chess move, wrapped in lace and protocol. A girl from Austria, raised in German, baptized in Latin, scolded in Italian, would be sent to Versailles to bridge an empire of silks and suspicion. Her smile would soothe, her womb would produce, her silence would serve. And so, at the age of 14, Antonia was plucked from Vienna like a song ending too soon. Her departure was ceremonial. Her carriage rattled down tree-lined avenues, escorted by guards in gold and diplomats in powdered wigs, as if grandeur could mask what was being done. They reached the banks of the Rhine, a river that had once marked blood-soaked borders, and arrived at a small, neutral island, prepared for a ceremony far more symbolic than sacred. Here, Antonia would be stripped of everything Austrian, her gowns, her jewels, her attendants, even her beloved dog. The French demanded total erasure, a new girl to be born under their flag, shaped in their image. Inside the tent, lined in velvet and formality, the transformation began. They removed her Austrian dress and replaced it with a French one, not with care but with ritual. Her hair was unpinned and restyled to mimic court fashion. Her gloves replaced. Her name shortened. from Maria Antonia to simply Marie Antoinette. A gesture cloaked in ceremony, but beneath it, cruelty, a quiet exile. There is no warmth in this kind of baptism. No celebration. Only silence and eyes that watched her like an object being exchanged. Not a girl, but a symbol. Outside, the Rhine flowed cold and gray beneath the sky. The wind stirred the edges of the ceremony tent like breath trying to escape. Marie stood motionless, cloaked in the colors of a country she'd never seen. The weight of a destiny she didn't choose pressing into her collarbone like invisible fingers. When she stepped into the waiting French carriage, she did not look back. It is said that children remember the world in colors and smells. The lavender from her governess's sleeves, the cold iron of her mother's throne room, the yellow glass glow of Vienna at dusk. But on that island in the middle of a river, all those memories were folded away like silk packed in a trunk. She had become something else now. Not Antonia, not a girl, but the Austrian doll, fragile, dressed for show, placed on a throne no one believed she could truly rule. And Versailles was waiting. Versailles shimmered like a golden illusion from the outside. A palace stretched across stone and mirrors, where sunlight played on gilded ceilings and marble floors like it too had been trained to bow. But inside, beneath the glitter and gold leaf, there was no warmth, only performance. The corridors were wide but suffocating. Everything smelled faintly of wax, powder, sweat, and secrets. Even the air felt choreographed, as if one breathed only by permission. Marie Antoinette, barely 15, was no longer a girl, but not yet a queen. She had entered a stage, and Versailles demanded not truth, but precision. First, she smiled too much. She laughed at the wrong things. She waved too eagerly. In Vienna, such gestures were endearing. In France, they were ammunition. Every hour of her day was watched. From the moment she opened her eyes, there were eyes on her. Ladies of the court assigned to undress her, to brush her hair, to place her stockings. Even when she bled, there were witnesses to fold and observe the linens. There was no privacy, no pause, only presence. At night, she lay beneath tapestries so rich they muffled her thoughts, in a bed carved for queens, alone in every way that mattered. Her new husband, Louis Auguste, the Dauphin of France, was awkward, gentle, and completely unprepared for her, or for ruling. He rarely looked her in the eye. He avoided conversation. He preferred locks, hunting, and long silences. Their wedding night passed quietly. So did the next, and the next. Months became years. The marriage remained unconsummated. It wasn't a matter of cruelty. Louis was not cruel. He was merely distant, clumsy with touch, afraid perhaps of failing and so never truly trying. Rumors spread like ink on wet parchment. The court whispered that she was barren, that she was frigid, that she was too childish to rouse a man. No one blamed the Dauphin. The blame settled, silently, like ash, on her powdered shoulders. In a palace where women were meant to produce heirs and influence kings, Marie Antoinette did neither. So she became a spectacle instead. She played her part with painted grace. Each morning, she curtsied to the king, to his mistresses, to strangers who had earned the right to watch her eat breakfast. Her dresses grew wider, taller, more elaborate. Her hairstyles became absurd sculptures of defiance. Ships, birds, even whole gardens arranged in powdered wigs. If she could not win affection, perhaps she could distract from absence. But beneath the feathers and diamonds, she remained untouched. She wrote long letters to her mother, begging for patience, for advice, for warmth. Maria Theresa replied with cold counsel. Be obedient, be fruitful, be perfect. Each failure was hers alone. And Versailles, that shimmering cage, never slept. Behind every curtain was a rival. Behind every gesture, a test. The court functioned like a living creature. Beautiful, venomous, and always hungry. The nobility, starved of real power, fed on gossip. They dissected her smiles, her gowns, the way she walked, the moments she looked too bored or too happy. She was accused of arrogance when she frowned. of seduction when she smiled, of extravagance when she simply lived. She learned slowly to say less, to feel less. Her voice became softer, her expressions controlled, her laughter hollow. It was safer to become silent than to be misquoted. But silence is not safety. It is simply a slower death. She spent long hours in her private rooms, painting, sewing, playing the harp, small acts of gentleness in a world that demanded spectacle. The Petit Trianon, a small retreat gifted to her by Louis, became her sanctuary, a place with no courtiers, no rituals, no endless bows. There she could pretend for an hour that she was simply a girl again, free, real. But even that was used against her. They called her selfish, detached, an Austrian spy in French silk. And still Louis said nothing. He tinkered with locks while his young bride withered beside him in silence. She longed to be seen, not as a queen, not as a symbol, but as a girl, a wife, a human being. But no one, not her husband, not her court, not even her mother, allowed her that luxury. Versailles was never home. It was a mirror that distorted, a stage that demanded, and a prison gilded so beautifully no one dared call it by name. And so she became what they accused her of being: distant, extravagant, numb. Not because she was born that way, but because the palace gave her no other shape to take. In the eyes of France, Marie Antoinette was a doll, painted, polished, and empty inside. But dolls, when ignored long enough, do not break. They learn to smile in stillness, and they begin to listen. She could not command the court. She could not command her husband, but she could command attention. Versailles did not reward goodness, it rewarded spectacle. And Marie Antoinette, so long ignored, began to play the only role left to her, the queen they imagined her to be. If they called her frivolous, she would become dazzling. If they whispered that she was cold, she would shine so brightly it burned. She began with fabric, brocade and lace, silks that shimmered like water, pastels that no one else dared to wear. Her gowns widened into impossible shapes, skirts so vast they required servants to help her pass through doors. Her hair was powdered sky-high, adorned with miniature ships, plumes, even exotic fruits. Each appearance became a performance. Each day, a tableau vivant staged for a kingdom that demanded theater and pretended it was truth. She didn't dress for vanity. She dressed to exist. The more absurd her style, the more space she took up. In a court that wished her silent, she became a spectacle no one could ignore. If Versailles would not let her speak, it would at least have to look. Behind her eyes, however, something else was shifting. Beneath the pearls and powder, Marie was building something quieter. At the edge of the palace grounds, beyond the marble and surveillance, there stood a small estate, Le Petit Trianon. It had been gifted to her by Louis, not out of love, but out of appeasement. Yet, in its quiet gardens and simple walls, Marie Antoinette found the only place in France where she could breathe. There were no courtiers at Petit Trianon, no rules of etiquette, no audience, just curated stillness, white muslin instead of brocade, butter and honey instead of gold. Here she built a version of herself untouched by ritual. She planted flowers. She played music. She laughed without watching her reflection. And then she played farmer. She commissioned an entire hamlet. Tiny cottages with thatched roofs, wandering ducks, faux milkmaids with buckets never meant to be filled. She and her ladies dressed in shepherdess gowns, soft and rustic, and wandered the estate like characters in a pastoral painting. It was escapism, yes, but it was survival. To live under the weight of expectation was to drown. In the world outside Petit Trianon, every breath was measured, every smile taxed. In this fantasy, she could imagine freedom, even if it was artificial. But Versailles does not forget, and France never forgave what it failed to understand. The gossip came in waves. The queen, they said, mocks the poor. She plays milkmaid while peasants starve. She spends lavishly while the treasury bleeds. They invented numbers. They imagined lovers. They twisted silk into sins and laughter into insults. And Marie, who had never governed a law or led an army, was blamed for everything. She had no real power, but she made an easy symbol. A woman, a foreigner, a queen who did not conform. And Versailles, for all its decadence, had rules. Rules Marie did not bend, she broke. She married but did not mother. She ruled but did not reign. She smiled but not always at the right people. And in a country descending toward hunger and rage, that was enough to mark her as guilty. They called her Madame Deficit. They imagined her bathing in champagne, lighting cigars with banknotes. They said she told the starving to eat cake, though she never did. But lies spread faster than fire, and Marie had been flammable for years. She was not hated for what she did. She was hated for what she represented. An untouchable woman in a collapsing world. A mask of wealth while the floorboards rotted beneath. She wore powder to cover the worry, wigs to hide the silence, ribbons to hold her together. She learned that the higher she built the mask, the safer she was behind it. But even the finest masks crack. The petite Trianon was watched. Her friends were scrutinized. Her letters were opened. There was no more escaping. There were only roles left to play, and Marie had been performing for so long. Even she no longer knew where the mask ended and the woman began. History paints her as a fool, a woman out of touch, a queen who danced while the kingdom burned. But beneath the rouge and ridicule was a girl who had never been taught to rule, only to survive in a world where survival meant becoming exactly what they expected, until it killed her. Versailles was built to dazzle. A golden labyrinth of mirrors and marbled corridors where power danced in silence and ambition wore perfume. But beneath the glittering chandeliers and silk-lined halls, something colder stirred. Something that did not bow or smile, only watched. Marie Antoinette had entered this place not as a ruler, but as prey. From the first moment she set foot inside, the wolves had begun to circle. They did not bare their teeth, not yet. They curtsied. They kissed hands. They whispered in salons, behind fans, behind doors that were never truly closed. They took note of the way she walked, the way she laughed, the way she failed to speak to those who thought themselves untouchable. Madame du Barry was the first to strike. She had the king's favor, a sharp tongue, and the instincts of a survivor. Marie, barely more than a child, saw in her something vulgar, a disruption of everything she had been taught about royal dignity. So she refused to speak to her. For weeks, months, a silent standoff that might have passed as youthful pride, if it had not insulted the king himself. That silence became a seed, and Versailles is the kind of soil where seeds of resentment flourish. The court began to choose sides, not with declarations, but with glances. Marie's youth, her foreignness, her laughter, all began to curdle in the mouths of courtiers who had waited too long for favor. The Austrians had sent a porcelain bride, they said, pretty puppet, a girl who did not know her place, and so they began to push her into one. She became a spectacle and then, slowly, a scapegoat. Each time she smiled too brightly or danced too freely, someone whispered that it was unbecoming. Each new gown she wore was measured not in meters of silk but in imagined debts to the treasury. Her desire for music, for gardens, for stillness reframed as selfishness. It did not matter that she had no real power. She was watched as if she did. She was blamed as if she had commanded armies. Her very presence became political. The rustle of her skirts was enough to stir scandal. And then came the diamond. Not her diamond, not her request, but her name, her silence, her crown, all made her guilty before she had even heard the accusation. The necklace was grotesque, grotesquely expensive. A web of diamonds meant once for a royal mistress long dead. When a conwoman wove lies around it, when a cardinal fell for those lies, and when forged letters named Marie Antoinette as the secret buyer, the world believed what it wanted to believe. They believed she would spend a nation's future on a string of gems. They believed she would use seduction and secrecy to get what she wanted. They believed because by then, the truth no longer mattered. The court pretended to be shocked. But they had been waiting. The people outside the gates, hungrier by the day, took the scandal like flint to dry grass. They shouted her name in the streets, not as a queen, but as a curse. Inside her private chambers, Marie wept, begged Louis to speak, to defend her, to do something. But Louis, kind and slow and paralyzed by the weight of kingship, remained quiet. And Versailles, ever loyal to the scent of power, began to look away. The palace that had once polished her image now reflected only blame. The courtiers who had danced beside her at masquerades now turned their masks inward. No one defended her. Few even dared to stand close. She had not ruled. She had not conquered. She had not written the laws that bled the poor dry. But she had become a face, a symbol, a vessel for every disappointment that France had buried under marble and gold. The wolves did not tear her down with claws. They did it with elegance, with pamphlets, with satire, with songs sung in the streets. She was accused of coldness, of extravagance, of laughing too loudly while the country starved. Not because she did these things, but because they made sense within the story the world had already decided to tell. And so the mask hardened. She smiled less. She retreated into private rooms. She watched the court shift around her like a stage that no longer had a part for its former star. She stood beneath her crown, but it no longer fit. It weighed heavier than ever. A thing once made for ceremony now used to cage. In Versailles, nothing was sacred. Not youth, not marriage, not innocence. Least of all, a queen without allies. For years, her worth had been measured by what she had not done. No heir, no consummation, no political influence. Her crown had sat heavily on a head so young, so watched, yet so powerless. But at last, after nearly 8 years of whispers, it happened. On a spring morning in 1778, Versailles held its breath as Marie Antoinette, now 23, gave birth to a daughter. Marie-Therese Charlotte, a healthy child, a girl. Not the son France had prayed for, but a symbol nonetheless. The court erupted in orchestrated celebration. The queen had fulfilled her duty. At last, she was not simply the Austrian, not the scandal, not the puppet, but the mother of France. For a moment, she was radiant. Even the people, starved of patience, offered her grace. Portraits were painted, songs composed, pamphlets praised her at last. A rare shift in the wind. Her own body, long mocked, was no longer seen as decorative. It had produced, and for that, she was briefly, blissfully, untouchable. But nothing in Versailles stayed golden for long. The child was soon swept into the arms of nurses and governesses. Marie, like all royal mothers before her, was allowed little closeness. Her daughter's first steps, first words, all witnessed by others. The monarchy required children as symbols, not as bonds. And though she begged for more time, more contact, the rules did not change. Even her joy was choreographed. She would have 3 more children. A son, Louis Joseph, finally the Dauphin. A second boy, Louis Charles. And then a final daughter who would not survive infancy. The people's affections rose with each birth. The pamphlets grew kinder. Her gowns more maternal. She was no longer just the foreign queen who wasted coin on diamonds and masked balls. She was now the mother of the future king. But the illusion cracked faster than it formed. Her eldest son, Louis Joseph, was delicate from birth. Pale, prone to fever, his health flickered like a candle in a corridor. Versailles, ever restless, watched him not with sympathy, but suspicion. The heir was fragile, and when he died just shy of age 8, the court did not weep. It repositioned. The death of a child should have been private. But nothing in her life belonged to her alone. The funeral was cold. The gossip, immediate. The grief, hers alone. And yet she endured it all with the silence she had learned so well. Letters from her mother continued to arrive, laced with reprimands and disappointment, even as death tightened its grip on the family. For years, Marie had tried to please Maria Theresa, to be worthy of the empire that had birthed her. But the letters had begun to sting like wounds that never healed. So she burned them, not out of rage, but out of exhaustion. of finally accepting that there would be no home left to return to. Not in Vienna, not in France, not anywhere. She wrote her own letters now, long and aching, addressed to no one and everyone. Sometimes she wrote to her dead children. Sometimes to a future self she no longer believed would arrive. The ink blurred with tears. The script hardened. These were not royal decrees. They were the fragile fragments of a woman trying to remain whole. And all the while, her surviving children were pulled into the machinery of monarchy. Her second son, Louis Charles, now the Dauphin, became less her child than her obligation. Tutors, rules, propaganda, and as the revolution stirred beyond the palace gates, even motherhood became a kind of battlefield. She was no longer praised. She was watched again, as if her touch might poison, as if her love was undeserved. They said she spoiled her children, that she wept too often, that she laughed too little. Her very instinct to protect them was treated as political. She had spent her youth being measured by her womb, and now, in grief, she was measured by her restraint. Versailles did not care that she hurt. It only cared that she remained composed. And so she returned to her mask. A little tighter now, a little harder to remove. She dressed her children in simple cotton. She smiled at their lessons, even when her heart screamed. She took them into gardens, hoping the sun could drown out the voices beyond the gates. But even there, behind hedges and roses, she was not alone. Eyes followed, reported, judged. Marie Antoinette was not allowed to be a mother in the way she needed, only in the way the court demanded. Soft but silent, present but politically neutral. Her love was not trusted, her mourning not believed. And so, though she had birthed 4 children, she remained untouched by sanctuary. A mother under glass, fragile, preserved, constantly examined for cracks. The world had given her a crown and then punished her for carrying it. It had given her children and then punished her for loving them. And all the while, outside the palace walls, the voices of the people were rising, not in song, but in hunger, in fury, and they were no longer whispering. It began not with a roar, but with hunger. The air in Paris had grown bitter. Bread was scarce, trust even more so, while the palace continued its endless cycle of formality, powdered rituals, feathered diplomacy. Outside, people waited in lines that stretched like scars across the city. Children cried from hollow bellies. Mothers cursed with cracked lips. And through it all, one name rose louder than any other. Madame Deficit. It wasn't just a nickname. It was a sentence. An accusation sewn into every whispered story of waste. Every satire pasted to the walls. Every joke muttered in taverns. Marie Antoinette had become not just a queen, but a caricature. A powdered monster who danced while the people starved. The woman they once watched with envy, they now followed with hatred. She had never written a tax, never passed a law, but in the imagination of the nation, it was her hands pulling the strings, her appetite that drained the coffers, her smile that laughed over empty plates. The storming of the Bastille shook Versailles not with gunfire, but with realization. The rules had changed. The stage was breaking beneath her feet. And still, Marie tried to stand tall. But the distance between crown and cobblestone had never felt so dangerous. In the summer of 1791, the royal family made their desperate move. A plan whispered behind locked doors, mapped in candlelight. Disguises, fake names, a midnight departure, all leading to Varennes, and from there to the border. To safety, to sanctuary. They left dressed as servants, hoping anonymity could buy them the escape that blood could no longer guarantee. But the plan unraveled like silk in the rain. The queen's posture was too elegant, her eyes too known. At an inn, a man recognized her from the coins. The profile of a monarch had become her own undoing. The people caught them just before they reached the edge. A family dragged from their carriage, royal lace torn by peasant hands. They were marched back to Paris not as sovereigns, but as criminals in slow procession. The queen rode in silence. Her children pressed against her, while the crowds jeered and threw mud, and somewhere between town and city, the monarchy itself collapsed. Something had shifted. Irrevocably. Marie Antoinette was no longer simply disliked. She was no longer gossiped about, laughed at, or ignored. She was hated. Viscerally. Politically. Personally. To the revolution. She became the ghost of every injustice. The weight behind every tax. The face of every lost child. Every broken harvest. Every torn coin. Her crown had once given her power. Now, it made her a target. Versailles was abandoned. The family moved into the Tuileries, a prison dressed as a palace. The mirrors were smaller. The windows thicker. Guards stood in doorways that had once been held by valets. There was no music now. No laughter. Only watching. Marie no longer wore silk. She sewed clothes for her children by hand, using thread that snapped too easily. She wrote fewer letters, smiled less. Even her enemies noted the change, the exhaustion carved into her cheeks, the weight in her voice. But the people didn't want repentance. They didn't want reality. They wanted vengeance. And vengeance needs a symbol. The trial was inevitable even before it was named. Charges written in ink that had already dried. Accusations of treason, of excess, of conspiracy with Austria. They painted her as a traitor mother, a foreign snake, a monarch who had poisoned France from within. No one listened to her words. No one wanted to. The courtroom was not a place for truth. It was a theater. The audience had decided its verdict long before she entered. When she stood before the tribunal, she no longer looked like a queen. She looked like a widow, a prisoner. Her hair, once powdered high and adorned with pearls, had been shorn. Her hands, once weighed with rings, trembled bare. Her voice, once trained to soothe a court, was steady now not with confidence but with resolve. And yet none of it mattered. She had ceased to be human in the eyes of the crowd. She was not a woman, not a mother, not even a monarch. She was an emblem, a scapegoat, a head waiting for the blade. The Seine moved slowly past the conciergerie, dark and swollen like a vein through a dying city. Inside, stone walls sweated with damp. Rats stirred in the corners. The air stank of mold and metal, of bodies pressed too long against the same cold floor. Somewhere above, Paris kept moving, carts and boots and bells. But down here, time stopped. Marie Antoinette was no longer a queen. She had no crown, no title, no mirrors to remind her who she had once been. Her world had shrunk to a cell no wider than her old dressing room. The walls were mottled with age and old cries. The straw mattress never dried. A single barred window let in gray light when it cared to. At night, the water from the river kissed the stones beneath her feet and reminded her how close she was to forgetting warmth altogether. She was 37. But the years had folded hard. Her hair, once the fashion of Europe, had gone pale. Not just from age but from grief, from fear, from the slow unraveling of every identity she had been forced to wear. Her face was hollow now, the lines not drawn by luxury, but by waiting. Her body, once dressed in silks and crushed velvet, sagged beneath coarse wool and stained linen. No perfume, no powder, just skin, and breath, and silence. The guards watched her at all hours. Even when she slept, if she slept, someone stood with arms crossed, eyes fixed. There was no privacy, no kindness. Meals came late and cold. Some of the guards leered. Others looked away. A few seemed ashamed, but none of them spoke. She had once been surrounded by music. Now the only sound was dripping water and the soft scurry of things that had no names. On the final night, a candle was allowed. She was given a chair, a scrap of paper, a quill worn blunt. No one said why. No one needed to. She knew. Marie Antoinette sat for a long time before she wrote. The candle flickered, fought the damp, burned low. Her hands shook more than she wanted them to. The words didn't come easily. Not because she didn't know what to say, but because there was too much. She began the letter slowly, to Madame Elizabeth, her sister-in-law, the only one left who might understand. The ink bled slightly, the candlelight catching the strokes like a heartbeat. She apologized for everything. Not her crimes, but her helplessness. Her failure to protect the children. Her failure to stay strong. Her failure to make sense of what had become of them all. She begged Elizabeth to care for the boy, Louis Charles, if anyone could still reach him. She hoped he hadn't forgotten her voice. She asked that he be told she loved him. Always without hesitation, until the very last breath. At some point, her hand cramped, and she held the quill so tightly that it cut her finger. A drop of blood smeared onto the paper. She kept writing. The words wobbled, cracked. She no longer cared if the lines were straight. Only that they existed. Only that, in a few hours, someone would know that she had not gone quietly, that she had remembered love, that she had remembered how to feel something other than fear. When the candle burned low and began to spit, she folded the letter carefully, sealing it with fingers that no longer knew grace. She whispered a prayer, not to save her, that was long past, but to be remembered not as a monster, not as a figure of hatred, but as a woman who had once been loved, who had once tried to love in return. No one came to collect the letter that night. The prison did not comfort her. There were no final blessings, no chamberlain to offer regrets, no courtiers at her door, just stone, and the smell of wet iron. Outside, the streets were already humming. The scaffold had been checked, the wood swept clean, the blade oiled, cart prepared. But in her cell, there were no bells, no clocks, just breath and silence. She lay down for a moment, but the straw bit into her back. She didn't cry. There was no one to hear it. And even if there had been, no one would have dared. She closed her eyes and let the dark press down on her gently. No dreams came, not of Vienna, not of Versailles, not of music or roses or golden halls. Only the slow rise of dawn on the walls of a prison that had no need for memory. The morning of October 16th broke gray and indifferent. A thin mist clung to the rooftops of Paris as if the city itself were holding its breath. Inside the conciergerie, Marie Antoinette stood without ceremony. No one helped her dress. No handmaid, no daughter of Austria, no chamberlain. She wore a plain white gown, stiff from washing, rough at the seams, the only symbol of purity left to a woman no longer allowed a name. The Queen of France had become merely the widow Capet, a body the state would soon dispose of. Her hands were tied behind her back. Her once powdered hair had been cut close to the scalp, not by fashion but by necessity, to give the blade a cleaner path. They did not blindfold her. That, perhaps, was the last kindness. Or perhaps it was punishment, to make her watch every inch of the road between breath and silence. The cart that came for her was not enclosed like the one they had given Louis. Hers was open, deliberate, a display. They placed her upright on a wooden bench as if she were some strange relic being returned to the people. 2 guards flanked her, rifles resting on their knees. The horse snorted, and the wheels creaked forward. The stones of Paris were slick with the morning fog. The hooves clattered. The iron rims ground into the uneven path. She did not speak. Her chin remained level, her mouth still. Only her eyes moved, flicking quietly across the faces that lined the streets. And the silence, it was not what she had expected. No jeers, no shouts, no rotten fruit, only eyes. They watched her pass not like a queen, not even like a villain, but like something already halfway gone, something hollowed out, something human too late to matter. They had come to see her die, but they would not give her their voices. She sat straight in the cart, white against the wet black of Paris. There was no crown, but her posture remembered it. Her breath was shallow, but steady. Her skin pale, but clean. For all their hatred, she would not give them fear. The journey to the Place de la Revolution was long. Long enough to remember, long enough to regret. But if she felt either, she gave no sign. Somewhere behind her eyes, perhaps she was walking again in Schönbrunn, the scent of orange blossoms, the laughter of sisters long buried, her mother's sharp voice in some distant hallway. Or maybe she saw her children, the way they looked before the locks, before the tribunals, before the long unraveling of their lives. Maybe she thought of Louis. Not the king, but the boy with trembling hands who had once blushed trying to speak to her. The man who died not with grandeur but with his jaw clenched in disbelief, as the crowd shouted not justice, but hunger. Or perhaps she thought of nothing. Perhaps that final dignity was hers alone, the ability to leave the world before it finished with her. The scaffold came into view slowly, rising like a stage not meant for actors but for sacrifice. The blade gleamed above it, silent and still. The executioner waited, his face unreadable, his hands already bloody from the last death. They did not give her pause. They did not offer prayer. She stepped down from the cart carefully. The wood of the scaffold was damp. The sky hung low above it. The wind stirred only once, briefly, like a breath drawn before the final line. Marie Antoinette walked alone to the foot of the platform, her hands still bound, her gown whispering against her legs. She stumbled once, slightly, and murmured an apology to the man who held her elbow. "Pardon me, monsieur. I did not mean to," she said, her final words, not to the people, not to history, but to a man about to kill her. The crowd leaned forward, not with bloodlust, but with something colder, resignation. As if, in seeing her brought low, something ancient had finally been closed. There was no applause, no cheers, just breath. She was laid face down beneath the blade, her neck exposed, pale against the stained wood. A moment, no drum roll, no speech, just the weight of waiting. The guillotine fell, a sound like thunder in a room with no walls. The head rolled, almost softly, into the basket. The body twitched once, then stilled. Blood sprayed the boots of the executioner. Warm and bright, it clung to the platform like ink, and the crowd exhaled, not in triumph, not in mourning, but in something that felt eerily like relief, as if, in killing her, they had cut away a piece of history too burdened to carry any longer. As if the nation, torn and bleeding, had needed her death not for justice but for narrative. Marie Antoinette died not for what she had done. She died for what she had become, a mirror of power, a ghost of indulgence, a symbol too heavy to keep alive. The echo of the blade faded quickly in the cold October air, but Marie Antoinette's silence lingered far longer. It moved through the cracked streets of Paris, through the empty halls of the Tuileries, through the scorched memory of a nation still unsure what, exactly, it had won. Her body was gone, buried in haste, in secret, but her image was already being exhumed, again and again, carved anew by hands that had never touched her and tongues that had never spoken to her. The queen was dead, but the idea of her had only just begun to live. In life, she had been painted in oils and in satire. Her face adorned portraits in velvet, pamphlets in filth. She was a child bride, a mother, a foreigner, a villain, a woman accused of everything and permitted nothing. Now, in death, she became something stranger, a blank page upon which every generation could write its own grievance, its own fascination, its own fear of power made flesh. They called her Madame Deficit, because it was easier than saying the system had failed. They mocked her hair, her dresses, her laughter, because mocking is easier than mourning. And still, her name was whispered, even in revolutionary cafes, even by those who had cheered the guillotine. Her absence became a presence, caution, a curiosity, a question no execution could fully answer. The press, which had once weaponized every detail of her life, continued the work of resurrection. They printed etchings of her final ride, invented last words, reimagined her as both martyr and monster. 1 month she was the tragic mother, the next the Austrian witch, memory bent with appetite. The same hands that had built the gallows now reached for the pen, and with each stroke, they turned a woman into a myth too large to bury. And Versailles, that gilded illusion of permanence, stood in eerie silence. The mirrors remained. The gold still flaked in corners. The ceilings held their painted gods. But the music had stopped. The courtiers had fled. The fountains ran, but only for the wind. Where once the queen had walked in silks, Tourists would one day shuffle in sneakers. And the Petit Trianon, once her escape, once her fragile theater of make-believe freedom, became a mausoleum to misunderstood luxury. They did not burn the palace. They preserved it, because even in revolution, power still craved beauty. Versailles was no longer a home, it was a display, a wound set behind glass. The bedchamber of the woman they executed now offered velvet ropes and informational plaques. Visitors murmured through her salons, mouths full of judgment or wonder, peering into rooms that once judged her in silence. They stared at the mirrors she once hated, at the tapestries chosen to please a court that never loved her. They touched the edges of her world but never the weight. And perhaps that is how she survives. Not in the bloodlines that followed, though her son, Louis Charles, was swallowed by the revolution, his tiny voice silenced in a cell with no name. Not in monuments, for they built none for her, but in the way her story refuses to die. She lives in questions. Why did they hate her? What did they see in her that terrified them so? Was it the accent? The gowns? Or simply that she smiled too brightly for a world unraveling? She became the vessel for a collapsing monarchy, a lightning rod for resentment that had been centuries in the making. The people who died of hunger saw her feasts. The women who lost children saw her cradling hers. The men who could not read saw her name printed everywhere. She was guilty not of tyranny, but of reflection. She showed them a world they were not allowed to enter, and so they destroyed her. But history, even at its cruelest, does not forget. It mutters her name in textbooks, paints her again in softer tones, tries to unearth the girl beneath the crown, to reconstruct the silence between the scandals. Some call her misunderstood, others complicit. The truth, as always, breathes between the extremes. What remains certain is this: Marie Antoinette died not for what she did, but for what she represented. In her, the revolution saw everything it needed to kill, and in her death, they found no peace, only an echo. Versailles still stands. The floors she walked remain polished. Her bedroom, repainted. Her laughter erased but not entirely. You can still feel it in the walls if you listen closely. Not the laughter of extravagance, but the kind that hides loneliness, the kind that knows it's being watched. The Queen has no grave that most can visit, but she does not need one. Her legacy was carved into the myth of a collapsing world. History did not forgive her, but it never, ever let her go. She was born to wear silk and gold, but history only remembers her final white dress. Marie Antoinette was never the villain they needed her to be, nor the queen they hoped she might become. She was a mirror, cracked, tilted, and cruelly lit, reflecting the weight of a crown placed too early, too high, and without instruction. She did not fail as a monarch. She was simply never taught how to survive power that only looked like privilege. And in the end, the world did not kill her for what she did, but for what she dared to symbolize. If forgotten truths and silent tragedies matter to you, subscribe. There's always another shadow to follow.